I remember the sound before I remember the pain. It wasn't the photo, not yet. It was the tiny buzz of my phone on the nightstand, a vibration that sliced through the stillness of 3 a.m. like a pulse from another world. I almost didn't check it. Nights like that, silence feels sacred. But something in me knew. Maybe mothers always know. When I unlocked the screen, the light hit my face and the world shifted. A single image. My son, my Daniel, curled up under a bridge, his arm around a baby wrapped in a gray blanket. His head bowed, his face hidden, like he was trying to disappear. And yet, even in that grainy photo, I knew it was him. The curve of his shoulders, the shape of his hands. I used to hold those same hands when he was little, tracing his tiny fingers as if I could keep him safe just by memorizing their form. But that night, my boy wasn't safe. He wasn't home. He was sleeping on concrete while his baby cried into the wind. That image didn't just break my heart, it shattered the timeline of my life. There's a before and an after that photo. Before, I was a mother who believed that love could protect someone. After, I became a woman haunted by the question, what did I miss? I stared at the photo until my eyes burned. The light from the street lamp above them looked like an artificial halo. Too cruel, too bright. The kind of light that exposes, not saves. I called him. Straight to voicemail. I texted. No response. The last message he'd sent me months before read, "Don't worry, Mom. We're okay." I remember smiling when I read that. I'd even shown it to my sister, proud that he sounded strong again after so many setbacks. Now those words feel like a warning I didn't understand in time. I've replayed that night so many times that even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel the rough texture of my blanket against my hands as I sat up in bed, trying to breathe. I could smell the faint trace of lavender from the pillow spray I used to help me sleep. It felt obscene, to be surrounded by comfort while my son had none. You think you know pain until it comes wearing the face of your child. Then you realize pain isn't a wound. It's an echo. I walked to the window, still holding the phone, and looked out at the quiet street. Everything looked the same. Cars parked neatly, porch lights glowing, the neighbor's flag moving slightly in the wind. But inside me, nothing was the same anymore. I whispered his name, Daniel, as if the night might carry it to him. I sat on the floor beside the bed, shaking, praying. I hadn't prayed in years. But grief doesn't care about your beliefs. It drags you to your knees anyway. I remember asking the dark, what kind of world lets a baby sleep under a bridge while another woman, his wife, posts pictures from Dubai? The question didn't have an answer. It still doesn't. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not the cruelty of others, but the blindness of love. The things we don't see until it's too late. You see, I thought I'd raise Daniel to survive anything. But survival has layers. You can feed a man, clothe him, teach him to be kind, but you can't protect him from heartbreak disguised as ambition, or from the slow poison of shame. When he married Chloe, I thought he'd found his anchor. She was beautiful, bright, ambitious, the kind of woman who made everyone believe in better tomorrows. She said they'd travel the world together, build a business, give Emily a life of comfort. And for a while, it looked real. But somewhere along the way, she started chasing a different kind of dream, the kind that glitters on screens but rots underneath. While Daniel was working 2 jobs, Chloe was posting photos in designer sunglasses with captions like, "Hard work pays off." I used to like her posts. I even commented hearts once. I didn't know those pictures were funded by my son's exhaustion. And now, seeing that photo of him, mud-stained jeans, his baby's blanket torn, it made me wonder how long he'd been falling while I was pretending not to notice. I sat there until dawn, watching the light change color on the walls. You know that moment when night finally loosens its grip and the sky turns from black to a faint blue? It's supposed to be hopeful, but that morning, it felt like a spotlight revealing everything I'd failed to protect. When the sun finally rose, I made a decision that didn't feel like a decision at all. It felt like instinct. I packed a small bag, filled the gas tank, and printed the photo, because sometimes a mother's only compass is her guilt. As I drove through the city, I kept thinking about the last time I saw him. It was Thanksgiving. He'd said he couldn't stay long. Chloe had plans. He looked thinner, distracted, but I didn't ask. I just hugged him and said, "I'm proud of you." He smiled, that quiet, tired smile he always gave when he didn't want me to worry. And now I can't stop asking myself, proud of what? Proud that he was pretending? Proud that I was blind? The road stretched endless ahead of me, gray and wet from the morning dew. I didn't have an address. I didn't have a plan. All I had was that picture, and a voice inside that wouldn't let me rest until I found him. Maybe that's what love is at its rawest. Movement without logic. The kind of love that drives you forward even when you're terrified of what you'll find. The GPS kept recalculating, as if even the machine couldn't figure out where I was going. But I knew. I was going back. To him. To the truth. To the part of me that still believed redemption might exist somewhere between regret and forgiveness. I remember stopping at a red light, surrounded by people in their clean cars, sipping coffee, scrolling through their phones. I wanted to roll down my window and shout, "My son is under a bridge!" Not for pity, for witness, for proof that he existed beyond the silence. But I didn't. I just gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. And in that moment, I realized something that still haunts me. Sometimes, the people who are drowning don't make a sound. The first shelter I went to hadn't seen him. Neither had the second. I showed the photo again and again until the paper started to wrinkle from my hands. Each no felt like a door closing on the version of my son I used to know. By the time the sun set, I parked by the river and watched the lights flicker under the freeway. I imagined him somewhere close, holding Emily, singing softly like he used to when he was a boy, afraid of storms. And I whispered again, "Hold on, baby. I'm coming." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the car, the photo on the dashboard, my heart somewhere between guilt and prayer. If you've ever loved someone who lost their way, you know this ache, the desperate wish to go back in time, to change one small decision that could have rewritten everything. But life doesn't offer rewinds. It offers headlights cutting through the dark, 1 mile at a time. And that's where this story begins. Not with judgment, not with anger, but with a mother, a bridge, and the belief that love, even broken, still knows how to find its way home. I didn't go straight to the bridge that morning. I couldn't. Something in me needed to understand how such a distance could grow between two people who once shared the same heartbeat. So, instead, I went where everything had started to unravel, the glossy places where truth hides behind mirrors. I drove to the mall, not because I wanted to shop, but because I needed to see with my own eyes how the world could celebrate someone who left her family under concrete. Chloe's name had become a ghost in our house. I used to defend her, even when my sister said she was too much sparkle, not enough soul. I told myself she just had big dreams, that she was young, ambitious, modern. Isn't that what everyone preaches now? Dream big, live big. But standing there, in front of a window display full of handbags that cost more than my monthly rent, I felt something crack. Maybe it was my denial finally giving up its last breath. I could hear the sound of the escalator humming behind me, a low mechanical rhythm that reminded me of the old clock in my kitchen, the one that ticks too loud when the house is empty. Time mocking me again. I watched people walk by, bags swinging from their wrists, faces lit by the blue glow of their phones. Nobody looked up. Nobody saw me. It was like grief had turned me invisible. I took out my phone and opened Chloe's Instagram. I knew I shouldn't. It's like touching an open wound. But curiosity and pain are twins, always pulling you toward what hurts most. Her latest post was from Dubai, a penthouse balcony, the ocean a perfect turquoise behind her, her hand resting lightly on a designer bag, the caption, "Hard work, soft life." I remember feeling dizzy, like my heart couldn't find its rhythm. Hard work? My son was sleeping under a bridge. The only thing soft in his life was the blanket he wrapped his daughter in. And even that looked rough in the photo. It wasn't just anger that filled me. It was shame, because I had believed her. I'd believed the smiles, the filters, the captions about building an empire together. I'd even reposted one once, proud to show off what I thought was my son's happiness. Now, all I could see was the emptiness between the pixels. I sat on a bench and scrolled further down. More photos, more glitter, every image a knife, each like a small applause for a lie. It hit me then. The world doesn't care about truth, it cares about lighting. And Chloe had always known how to find the perfect light. I wanted to scream, but grief doesn't make noise. It corrodes quietly. I closed the app, but her voice stayed in my head. The way she used to say, "We'll make it big, you'll see." I thought she meant love. She meant followers. Outside, the sun was blinding. The kind of light that feels sterile, like it's bleaching the sky. I walked to my car and sat there without turning on the engine. My hands were cold, despite the heat. I looked at the photo of Daniel again, the one under the bridge. I kept zooming in, searching for details, proof of something redeeming. His shoes, maybe. The shape of the baby's blanket. Anything that could tell me it wasn't as bad as it looked. But the closer I looked, the more real it became. That's the strange thing about love. It teaches you to lie beautifully. To call despair a rough patch, to call absence space, to call loss life. For months, I had told everyone my son was doing fine. I had become fluent in half-truths. They're busy with work. He's saving up. They're traveling. Each sentence a bandage over a wound I didn't want to admit was festering. Maybe I wasn't protecting him. I was protecting myself. Because if I admitted he was drowning, I'd have to face the question, where was I while he fell? I turned on the car and drove aimlessly for hours, the city unfolding around me like a confession I wasn't ready to hear. Billboards of luxury watches, perfume ads, happy faces, all shouting one message, "You're failing if you don't shine." I used to believe that too. Now it made me sick. The farther I drove, the quieter it got. The houses turned smaller, the roads rougher. I didn't have an address, but something inside me pointed toward the edges, the places where people go when the world stops looking for them. I stopped at a small diner by the freeway, ordered a coffee I didn't drink, and showed the waitress the photo. She shook her head. "Try near the 405 underpass," she said softly, as if she'd said those words too many times before. Back in the car, I could hear my own breathing, every inhale heavy with guilt, every exhale a question. What would I say if I found him? How do you speak to a son who's fallen this far? Do you apologize? Do you pretend it's fixable? I thought about when he was little, how he used to line up his toy cars on the kitchen floor, each one perfectly placed. "Look, Mom," he'd say, "a road to anywhere." And now, decades later, here I was, driving roads that led nowhere. Maybe that's what growing up really means, realizing that anywhere can include the darkest places too. The sky turned amber as the sun began to sink. I could smell gasoline and something metallic in the air. My stomach ached with hunger, but food felt irrelevant. Pain has a way of making the body forget itself. When I finally reached the underpass, the sound hit me first, the low rumble of cars overhead, the hum of the city's heartbeat. I parked and sat still, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. My hands trembled around the steering wheel. I was afraid to get out, afraid of what I might see, afraid of what I might not. That's when I heard it, a baby crying, faint but real, the kind of cry that cuts straight through memory, through distance, through everything. My whole body froze. I wanted to run toward it, but my legs wouldn't move. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely think. I whispered his name as if the air might carry it. "Daniel." The sound of my own voice scared me. It had that hollow tone of someone who's been holding back too much for too long. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The wind smelled of rain and rust. Each step I took felt like stepping through my own past, through all the times I told him to be strong, to work hard, to never depend on anyone. Did I teach him resilience? Or did I teach him loneliness? I don't know. Maybe both. I followed the sound until I saw the faint shape of someone sitting near a pile of cardboard boxes. The crying grew softer, replaced by a hum, a lullaby. My chest tightened. That voice, even cracked and tired, I would recognize it anywhere. He was singing. And in that fragile melody, beneath the noise of the city and the weight of all our mistakes, I could hear it, the boy he used to be. For a moment, I couldn't move. The world went still. The air, the cars, even the pain, everything paused. I wanted to run to him, to hold him, to tell him that no bridge, no mistake, no heartbreak could ever make him unworthy of being found. But I also knew that whatever I said next could break us both. if I wasn't careful. So I just stood there, hidden in the dark, watching my son cradle his baby and whisper songs into the night. And I realized that this story wasn't about pity. It was about rediscovery, about the quiet ways we lose each other and the desperate, trembling ways we try to find our way back. I stayed there until my knees hurt, until the cold crept up through my coat, watching, waiting, remembering. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive with grand gestures or miracles. It arrives like this: one breath held between what was and what might still be. If you've ever stood on the edge of regret, listening to the echo of someone you once knew, you'll understand what I felt that night. The terrifying mix of hope and fear that makes you whisper into the dark, "Please, let it not be too late." He didn't see me at first. Maybe because the streetlight behind me threw my shadow in his direction, stretching it across the wet asphalt like an old memory reaching for what it had lost. Or maybe because he wasn't really looking. His whole world, right then, was the baby in his arms. I stopped a few feet away, afraid that moving closer might scare him off, like approaching a wounded animal. His voice was barely a whisper, cracked and rough, humming a song I hadn't heard in years. It was the same lullaby my mother used to sing to him when he was small. The melody floated through the cold air, broken, but still familiar. That sound did something to me. It pulled me backward through time, past the noise, the mistakes, the silence. For a second, I wasn't standing under a bridge. I was in his old bedroom again, walls covered with drawings, nightlight flickering, his little hand clutching a stuffed bear while I watched from the doorway, thinking he'd always be safe. When he finally noticed me, his shoulders stiffened. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then quietly, as if afraid of his own voice, he said, "Mom?" I don't remember crossing the distance between us, only the weight of his body when I hugged him. He was thinner, his skin colder, his smell a mix of rain, cigarette smoke, and exhaustion. Emily whimpered between us, and I felt her tiny hand brush against my wrist. That small touch, it was like a current ran through me. The reminder that life was still here, fragile and breathing, in my arms. We didn't cry. Not then. The tears came later. In that moment, we were both too stunned by the strange miracle of finding each other again, in a place meant for people the world no longer looks at. He broke the silence first. "Don't tell her where we are." At first I didn't understand, but then the pieces started fitting together, slowly, painfully. Chloe hadn't just left. She'd vanished, blocked his calls, drained their account. She had taken everything except the child she didn't want to care for. As he spoke, the words came out in bursts, half confession, half disbelief. He'd tried to hold things together, he said, tried to keep the apartment, to pay the bills, to find work. But every door closed, every promise turned into a delay. Eventually, the landlord stopped knocking and started shouting. He looked at me then, his eyes sunken but defiant. "I thought I could fix it, Mom. I really did." And I believed him, because I knew that tone, the stubborn pride of someone raised to endure, not to ask. I taught him that. God help me, I did. I taught him to stand tall, to never show weakness, to carry his storms in silence. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that no one should have to be that strong, but the words wouldn't come. So instead, I took off my coat and wrapped it around him. He didn't protest. For the first time in months, maybe years, he allowed himself to be cared for. The wind grew colder, sharp against our faces. I told him we couldn't stay there, that I'd get them a room, food, something warm. He hesitated, looking down at Emily. "We don't have anything," he said, almost apologetically. "You have me," I answered. We walked back to the car in silence. Emily made soft sounds, her little breaths fogging the air. I strapped her into the back seat as gently as I could. Daniel sat beside her, staring out the window, lost somewhere between shame and relief. As I drove toward the nearest motel, I kept glancing at them in the mirror. His profile against the passing lights, the baby's head resting on his arm. It felt surreal, like a scene from a life that didn't belong to me. I remembered my own father, years ago, coming home after losing his job. The same silence, the same pride. He'd sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, pretending everything was fine while my mother cried in the bathroom. I'd sworn I'd never repeat that pattern. But here it was again, replaying in a different key. Maybe some lessons take generations to unlearn. The motel smelled of bleach and cheap air freshener. I paid in cash, pretending not to see the receptionist's eyes linger on Daniel's clothes. Inside the room, the heater groaned to life, spitting out uneven warmth. Daniel placed Emily on the bed and sat beside her, shoulders slumped, hands trembling slightly. When I brought in the bag of food from the car, he didn't move. I watched him for a while before sitting down beside him. "Eat," I said softly. He nodded, but didn't. His eyes were locked on the baby, as if afraid that if he blinked, she might vanish. "Do you hate her?" I asked before I could stop myself. He looked up, startled. "Chloe?" "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "No, I hate myself for loving her." That broke something in me. Because it wasn't anger I heard. It was grief. The kind of grief that doesn't shout, that doesn't throw things. It just settles, like dust after an explosion, covering everything. I sat beside him, listening. He told me how Chloe used to laugh in her sleep, how she'd whisper plans for the future, how everything changed when success became more important than peace, how she'd tell him he wasn't ambitious enough, that he didn't look the part, how eventually he stopped recognizing himself in her eyes. He said it quietly, almost like a confession. "I thought if I worked harder, she'd stay." That line could have been mine. Because I used to think the same thing. If I just tried harder, if I just stayed calm, the world wouldn't fall apart. But life doesn't bargain that way. It takes what it wants, and you're left building again from what remains. I didn't realize I was crying until he reached out and wiped a tear from my cheek. His fingers were rough, but the gesture was tender. "Don't cry, Mom," he said. "We're okay now." Okay. Such a small word, such a heavy lie. We spent the night there. Emily fell asleep first, her tiny fists curling in rhythm with her breathing. Daniel drifted off next, exhaustion winning over fear. I stayed awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, watching them. The clock on the nightstand ticked louder with each second. I could hear it mocking me again. That steady reminder that time doesn't stop just because your heart does. Sabe quando o silêncio parece gritar? Quando cada pequeno som, o tique do relógio, o vento na janela, parece dizer, "Olha o que sobrou de você." I thought of all the things I wanted to tell him, but couldn't. That I forgave him. That I forgave myself. That sometimes love isn't enough to save someone, but it's still worth offering. At dawn, the room was filled with a dim golden light. Daniel stirred, his eyes half open. "Mom," he murmured, "thank you." I smiled, though it felt more like breaking. Always. When he fell back asleep, I finally allowed myself to close my eyes too. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't haunted by the question of where he was. I knew. And maybe that's the first step toward healing. Not finding all the answers, but simply finding each other again, even if it's in the most broken place imaginable. That morning, as the world woke up outside, I realized something. I couldn't change the past, but I could stay this time. I could be the witness to his rebuilding, not the echo of his fall. And so I sat there, between what was and what could be, listening to the quiet rhythm of two people breathing beside me, my son and his child, flesh of my flesh, proof that even in ruin, life insists on beginning again. Morning slipped into the room like a shy intruder, its pale light crawling across the cheap curtains, the stained carpet, the small form of my granddaughter asleep beside her father. The heater had stopped some time before dawn, and the air had that stillness that comes only after long nights of holding too much breath. I sat there, my back against the wall, and for a few minutes I let the silence wash over me. The kind of silence that isn't peace, but aftermath. Daniel stirred first. He blinked as if waking from another life, his eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling. "We made it through the night," he whispered. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was disbelief. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt tight, full of all the words I still hadn't said. Outside, the world was starting again. Cars, horns, footsteps, the ordinary rhythm of people moving forward while others, like us, stayed suspended between chapters. I thought of calling Chloe. Not to forgive her, not yet, but to confront her, to say, "You left them, but I didn't." But something in me hesitated. Maybe I wanted Daniel to choose that moment himself. Maybe I was afraid of hearing my own anger echo back at me. I went out to get coffee. The motel hallway smelled of bleach and loneliness. My footsteps sounded too loud against the tiles, like an unwanted confession. At the vending machine, I stared at my reflection in the metal surface. Eyes puffy, hair unkempt, skin mapped by sleepless nights. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. I looked like one of those women who had seen too much and learned to keep it quiet, and maybe that's what I had become. When I came back, Daniel was sitting on the bed, his phone in his hand. I could tell by the look on his face before he said a word. "She's online," he murmured. His voice was half wonder, half fury. "She posted again." He turned the screen toward me. Chloe, in a silk robe, holding a glass of champagne, a view of the city behind her. The caption, "Grateful for the life I built." Something inside me went cold. The contrast was unbearable. The soft light on her skin, the hunger in Daniel's eyes. I could almost hear the universe holding its breath, as if waiting to see which one of us would break first. He set the phone down. "I want to comment," he said quietly. "I want them to know." I hesitated. Then I nodded. "Say it." He shook his head. "No, you say it." And I did. My hands trembled as I typed. Just a single line, nothing more. "Your husband and baby are living under a bridge." I pressed send. The comment sat there for a few seconds before disappearing. Deleted, erased, like it had never existed. But I had seen it. She had seen it. And maybe that was enough. Daniel buried his face in his hands. "Now she'll come after me," he muttered. But when he looked up again, there was something new in his eyes. Something like release. The truth, once spoken, has a strange kind of mercy. For hours we said nothing. The world outside moved on, unbothered. I watched Emily's tiny chest rise and fall as she slept. Her innocence was unbearable. I wanted to promise her a world that didn't hurt people like this, but I couldn't. All I could do was stay. By evening, something unexpected began to happen. My phone started buzzing. Messages, notifications, people asking if the story was true, strangers offering food, clothes, help. The internet had done what it sometimes miraculously does. It listened. Daniel was terrified. "Mom, what did you do?" "I told the truth," I said. He didn't answer. But later that night, when I found him rocking Emily to sleep, I saw a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. Not joy, not yet, but the beginning of relief. Still, I couldn't sleep. I walked outside, into the night air. The sky was heavy with clouds, but one small gap let the moonlight spill through, a single streak of silver across the parking lot. The air smelled of gasoline and something sweet, like rain about to fall. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the freeway, to the distant sound of laughter from another room. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something soften inside me. Not forgiveness, but understanding. I thought of Chloe again, not as the villain I'd painted in my head, but as a girl who probably believed her own lies for a while. Maybe she thought success would make her whole. Maybe she was just running from the same emptiness we all run from. The realization didn't absolve her, but it freed me a little. Because holding on to anger is just another way of keeping someone alive inside you. When I went back inside, Daniel was asleep on the floor, Emily on his chest. The heater rattled weakly. I watched them for a long time, the faint glow from the streetlight drawing a line across their faces. There was something sacred in that stillness, the kind of silence that feels like an answer. I sat on the edge of the bed, and without meaning to, I whispered, "You're stronger than I ever was." He stirred, half awake, but didn't open his eyes. "Only because you taught me," he murmured. The words cut through me gently, like sunlight through fog. I'd spent so long believing I'd failed him that I'd lost the right to call myself a good mother. But maybe strength isn't inherited in the perfect moments. It's forged in the broken ones. Maybe all those nights I thought I was doing everything wrong were the nights he learned how to survive. The next morning, a reporter called. Someone had seen my comment before it was deleted. They wanted to share Daniel's story. I asked him what he wanted to do. He thought for a long time, staring at his hands. "Maybe it's time," he said. The interview was small, almost anonymous, but it reached enough people. Donations started to come in, just enough to move them out of the motel to a small apartment. The first night there, we all sat on the floor, eating instant noodles from paper cups. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. Daniel laughed when Emily threw noodles on his lap, and that sound, his laugh, hit me harder than any revelation. Because I realized I'd been holding my breath for years, waiting for that sound to return. The walls of the apartment were bare, the floor creaked, and the windows didn't close properly. But the light was soft, golden, almost forgiving. It made everything look like a promise. That night, when Daniel and Emily finally fell asleep, I stepped outside onto the small balcony. The air was cold but kind. Down below, the city pulsed with life. Cars, voices, music. All of it indifferent, all of it eternal. And I thought about the bridge, the photo, the guilt. How everything I'd carried for so long, the fear, the regret, had led me here, not as punishment, but as proof. Proof that love, even when it fails, still leaves something behind. I leaned on the railing, my breath forming small clouds in the air. The sky was clear now, the stars scattered like fragments of something once broken, but still shining anyway. That's what I felt in that moment. Not victory, not even happiness, just peace. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need witnesses, the kind that feels like standing in the middle of your own story and finally being able to breathe. Behind me, I heard Emily stir, a small cry that quickly faded as Daniel whispered something to calm her. I closed my eyes and smiled. For the first time, the sound didn't hurt. It sounded like life continuing, like forgiveness taking form in the dark. And somewhere deep inside, I knew. I was done chasing answers. The truth had already found me. In the light beneath a bridge, in the tremor of my son's voice, in the quiet resilience of a child who didn't yet know what had been lost. The rest, whatever it was, could wait for morning. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Not the one I once dreamed for him. No music, no grand dinners, no perfect photographs, but something quieter, sturdier. Daniel would wake early for work, his face still marked by the nights when Emily cried. I'd make coffee, pack his lunch, and watch him tie his worn boots by the door. The first time I saw him smile again, really smile, it was over something as small as Emily saying, "Da-da." The sound was clumsy, uncertain, but it made his eyes shine in a way that reminded me of his childhood, the boy who believed every problem had a way out. I'd forgotten how beautiful ordinary days could be when you've lived too long inside despair. The smell of toast, the echo of cartoons on the TV, the afternoon light spilling across the floorboards. It felt like the world had stopped spinning so fast, like we'd all been given a moment to breathe. Sometimes I caught myself staring at Daniel while he worked, fixing a loose shelf, feeding Emily, folding laundry with that same concentration he used to give to his art projects in high school. He used to draw bridges, thousands of them. He said he loved how they connected things, how they made distance less lonely. I never told him, but I kept one of those drawings folded in my purse for years. Looking at him now, I realized he'd become his own bridge, between who he was and who he had to become, between what we lost and what we still had. One evening, we were sitting by the small window of his apartment, watching the rain blur the city lights. Emily was asleep in her crib, her breath soft and rhythmic. The sound of the rain against the glass was steady, hypnotic. Daniel turned to me suddenly and said, "Do you ever think about Dad?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't spoken of his father in years. "Every day," I said. He nodded, his eyes distant. "I used to hate him," he admitted, "for leaving. But lately I've been wondering if maybe he was just lost, like I was." I looked at him for a long time. The man sitting in front of me wasn't the same son I had found under the bridge. There was still fragility in him, yes, but also clarity, the kind that comes only after being broken open. "You're not lost anymore," I said softly. He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but sometimes it feels like we all take turns being the one who leaves and the one who's left behind." The rain kept falling, blurring the line between sky and earth, between remembering and forgiving. And in that silence, I realized how much of my life I'd spent trying to fix what couldn't be undone. I had carried guilt like a heavy necklace, polishing it with every new regret. But now, looking at my son, I saw that guilt had no place left to live, because somehow, in spite of everything, we had found our way back. That night, after Daniel went to bed, I walked through the apartment, touching things absent-mindedly: the chipped mug, the baby blanket draped over the couch, the window where the streetlight leaked in gold. The quiet hummed like a heartbeat. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like presence. I found myself thinking about Chloe again, not with anger, but curiosity. What kind of emptiness makes someone run so far from love? What shadow do they carry that makes illusion feel safer than truth? I realized I didn't need answers. Forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't about giving someone a second chance. It's about freeing yourself from the question. A few weeks later, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name in small, familiar handwriting. Inside was a folded photo. Chloe, in a hospital gown, holding a newborn. The message on the back read, "I'm sorry for everything. Please tell him she has a sister." I sat down slowly, my heart racing, but not with shock, with understanding. Life has a strange way of finding symmetry, even when we think it's done with us. I knew I couldn't decide for Daniel whether he'd forgive her or not, but I also knew something deeper. This child would grow up knowing the truth, not the silence. I waited until evening to tell him. He listened quietly, his hands tightening around his coffee mug. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, "Maybe it's her chance to start over." And I realized that he had already forgiven her, long before the letter arrived. That night, I dreamed of the bridge again. The same one from his childhood drawings. But this time, it wasn't empty. I saw Daniel walking across, Emily in his arms, and on the other side, a small figure waiting. I couldn't see her face, but somehow I knew who she was. There was no fear in that dream, only light. When I woke up, the dawn was soft and gray. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the world stretch awake. For the first time, the ticking of the clock didn't feel like mockery. It felt like rhythm, like life continuing its quiet dance, no longer something I needed to control. That morning, I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the woman there, not because she looked older, but because she looked free. The lines on her face weren't reminders of sorrow anymore. They were proof of survival, proof that love, when it stays, doesn't stay perfect. It stays real. Emily woke up calling for her father. Daniel lifted her into his arms, and she giggled, that sound so pure it seemed to push every shadow out of the room. He looked at me and said, "We're okay, Mom. Really okay." I believed him. Not because everything was fixed, but because we had stopped pretending it needed to be. Later that day, we all went for a walk by the park. The air smelled of wet earth and jasmine. Emily took her first real steps there, clumsy and brave, her small fingers gripping Daniel's. I watched them from a bench, the sun setting behind the trees, the sky painted in that impossible shade between gold and blue. And for a moment, everything stilled. The noise of the city faded, the air grew warm against my skin, and I felt this quiet certainty bloom inside me, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. Because this, I thought, this is what survival looks like. Not winning, not forgetting, just existing fully, again. As we walked back home, I noticed the faint reflection of the sunset in a puddle near the curb. The bridge from the photograph flashed in my mind, not as a place of shame anymore, but as the beginning of a road we didn't know we were strong enough to travel. I took Daniel's arm, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a mother carrying her son's pain. I felt like a woman walking beside another survivor, equal, steady, whole. When we reached the building, I turned back one last time. The air smelled of rain and light. Emily laughed again, chasing a small bird across the sidewalk. Daniel called after her, and she ran back into his arms. And it was there, in that ordinary evening, wrapped in something extraordinary, that I finally understood. All the bridges we burn and rebuild, all the silences we break, all the losses we endure, they lead us here, to the simple truth that love is not about never falling. It's about who still reaches for you when you do. The house was quiet when I woke up that morning, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore. It just is. The air felt lighter, the light through the curtains warmer. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the sound of life moving on, unbothered, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened within these walls. And yet, inside me, everything had shifted. I walked barefoot across the living room floor. The tiles were cold, grounding. Emily's toys were scattered under the table, little flashes of color in a space that used to be empty. Daniel's jacket hung over the chair, his boots by the door, a small plant by the window leaning toward the morning light. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Maybe more than enough. I poured myself a cup of coffee and opened the window. The breeze carried the smell of rain and soil, the scent of things beginning again. For a long time, I just stood there, watching the world below, people rushing to work, a child chasing a dog, a woman balancing grocery bags. Ordinary life, flowing without permission or apology. And I realized something simple, almost ridiculous. I was still here, after everything. After the bridges, the silence, the loss, the fear, I was still here, breathing, witnessing. I smiled to myself quietly, because for years I thought survival had to look heroic. But maybe it looks exactly like this. Standing in your kitchen, holding a cup of coffee, realizing the world didn't end. You know that feeling when you stop fighting the past and it finally stops fighting back? It's like a tide that recedes quietly, leaving behind small shells, traces of what once was, but no longer hurts to touch. That afternoon, Daniel and I decided to visit the bridge, not out of guilt anymore, but out of gratitude. The drive was long and silent, but not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that feels full. Emily slept in the back seat, her little head bobbing gently with each turn. I kept looking at the reflection of Daniel's face in the window, calm, older, softer. When we arrived, the wind greeted us like an old friend. The underpass was the same, graffiti, broken bottles, the hum of traffic above. But it didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt like a witness, a page we had finally turned but still carried with respect. We stood there without speaking. I placed my hand on the cold concrete and closed my eyes. I remembered that first night, the panic, the smell of rain, the fear that maybe it was already too late. And now, standing in the same place, I realized it had never been about rescue. It had always been about return, about finding our way back to each other, not to who we were, but to who we could become. Daniel bent down and placed a small object near the wall, a tiny drawing Emily had made that morning, full of crooked hearts and bright colors. He smiled shyly. "A new beginning," he said. I nodded, tears warming my face before I could stop them. The wind picked up, scattering a few leaves around us. It carried the sound of distant laughter, maybe from the park nearby. For a moment, I imagined all the voices of the people who had helped us, strangers who sent messages, kindnesses, hope. It reminded me that the world can be cruel, yes, but also incredibly generous when you least expect it. Have you ever felt that? That strange balance between grief and grace, when both occupy the same breath, and somehow it makes sense? We walked along the river after that, Emily chasing the sunlight reflected on the water. The sky was a deep gold, the kind that makes everything look forgiven. I watched her run, her laughter echoing, and thought about how life insists on beauty even in the ruins. There's a tree near the water's edge, one that bends slightly toward the current. I sat under it while Daniel took photos of Emily. The ground was damp, the smell of wet earth sweet and familiar. I closed my eyes and listened to the river, the sound of movement, of continuity. For years I had feared endings. I thought every door closing meant loss, every silence meant distance. But now, sitting there, I understood that endings are just pauses that life takes to catch its breath. I remembered all the versions of myself I had been, the worried mother, the woman consumed by guilt, the one who believed she had failed. And for the first time, I looked at those versions with kindness. They were all trying. They were all learning. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not becoming someone new, but finally loving the one who survived. I opened my eyes again. Daniel was kneeling by the river, showing Emily how to skip stones. The ripples spread across the water, soft and circular, like quiet applause for existence itself. You ever notice how water never holds on to anything? It touches everything and lets it go. I think forgiveness is like that. Fluid, gentle, unstoppable once it begins. When the sun started to set, we walked back to the car. Daniel carried Emily, her head resting on his shoulder, and I walked a few steps behind, watching them. I thought of Chloe, not with resentment, but with acceptance. Her choices were hers, just as mine had been. Maybe her path still had a lesson waiting, as ours had. At the edge of the bridge, I stopped for a moment and looked back. The light was fading, turning the world into shades of amber and gray. I whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to everything. To the pain that broke us, to the love that rebuilt us, to the time that refused to rush our healing. I don't know what the future will bring. Maybe more storms, maybe more small joys. But I do know this: I'm not afraid of silence anymore. Because silence isn't absence, it's space. The space where forgiveness grows, where peace finally finds its way in. When we got home, I lingered by the door. The hallway light flickered once before settling, and in that flicker, I saw something symbolic: how even light can tremble and still shine. I closed the door slowly, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt home. I walked to the window and looked at the night sky. The moon hung low, soft and round, the same one that had watched over us through every fall and every return. I thought about how, no matter how many times the night darkens, morning always finds its way back. And maybe that's the truth I had been chasing all along. Not that life hurts less with time, but that we become wider, stronger, more spacious, able to hold both joy and pain without breaking. I sat down at the table, turned off the light, and let the darkness settle around me. It wasn't threatening anymore. It was kind, familiar, a reminder that we carry our own light, and that sometimes it's enough. You know, people say life goes on, but I don't think it goes anywhere. I think it stays. It stays in every word we said, in every touch we gave, in every bridge we dared to cross again. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of it all. I breathed deeply, the air cool against my skin, and whispered to no one in particular, "We made it." Then I smiled, because in some quiet, sacred way, I knew that making it was never about reaching a destination. It was about learning to walk again, even with the weight of everything you've carried.